Let me tell you something nobody wants to hear. The spiritual awakening you're chasing, the one promised in those glossy books with lotus flowers on the cover, the one whispered about in incense-filled rooms by people wearing white linen, it doesn't exist. Not in the way you think it does. What actually happens when consciousness begins to see through its own game is more like being flayed alive than finding peace. It's the universe reaching into your chest and pulling out everything you thought was you, piece by screaming piece, while you watch in horror and can't look away. You see people posting their transformation stories on social media, all sunshine and gratitude, talking about how they found themselves during a yoga retreat in Sedona, or after reading some book that changed everything. They're glowing, they're radiant, they speak in soft tones about surrender and presence, and the beauty of now. And you think, yes, that's what I want. That serenity, that certainty, that smile that suggests they've figured out the cosmic joke, and you're still fumbling with the punchline. But here's what they're not telling you, what they've either forgotten or never experienced deeply enough to remember. That glow you're seeing is either the honeymoon phase or a very convincing performance. Real awakening, the kind that actually transforms the structure of your consciousness rather than just redecorating your personality, is a process of systematic destruction that would make most horror films look like children's entertainment. I've watched it happen. I've lived it. I've sat with people as they came apart at the seams, and I've come apart myself more times than I can count. The path doesn't care about your plans, or your timeline, or how spiritually ready you think you are. When consciousness decides it's done playing your particular game of separation, it begins the work with all the gentleness of a forest fire. And the forest, my friend, is you. Everything you've built, every identity you've carefully constructed, every story you tell yourself about who you are and why you matter. All of it becomes fuel. The awakening process isn't interested in improving you. It's interested in erasing you completely and seeing what remains when the smoke clears. Most people never make it through. They get a taste, a glimpse of something beyond the ordinary boundaries of self, and they spend the rest of their lives either trying to recreate that moment or running from what it implied. Because that first taste is intoxicating, devastating, impossibly beautiful. You touch something so vast and so obvious that you can't believe you never saw it before. For a moment, maybe an hour, maybe a day if you're lucky, the walls come down and you experience yourself as everything and nothing simultaneously. The separation between you and the world dissolves like sugar in hot water. You feel connected to the trees, the sky, the strangers passing by, the atoms themselves. Love pours through you without an object or a reason. You understand viscerally that this is what all the mystics and sages were pointing toward. This is it. You've arrived. You're home. You're enlightened. Finally, after all that seeking, you've found what you were looking for. And then it ends. The peak experience fades. Ordinary consciousness reassembles itself like a familiar prison cell materializing around you. You're back in your regular life, with your regular problems, in your regular body that still hurts in the same places. But now you know. You've tasted the nectar, and everything else tastes like cardboard by comparison. This is the honeymoon phase, and it's perhaps the cruelest trick consciousness plays on seekers. Because that initial opening, that first kiss from the infinite, creates a hunger that cannot be satisfied and a knowledge that cannot be unknown. You become like someone who's discovered they've been living in a cardboard box their whole life, while a mansion stood just outside. Except now, you're back in the box, and the walls feel tighter than ever before. People in this phase become intolerable to be around. Though they rarely realize it, they've had their glimpse, their moment of clarity, and now they walk around half-drunk on the memory of it, trying to explain colors to people they now see as living in black and white. You try to share what you've experienced with your partner, your friends, your family, and you watch their eyes glaze over with polite concern. They nod, they smile, they change the subject to something safer, like politics or the weather, and you realize with creeping dread that you can't go back to caring about the things they care about, but you also can't stay in the state you briefly touched. You're caught between worlds, belonging fully to neither, and the isolation begins to set in like frost in your bones. Then comes the hangover. If the peak experience was the sugar rush, this is the crash that follows. Your normal state of consciousness, which used to feel just fine, now feels like a straitjacket. The thoughts that used to occupy your mind seem trivial and repetitive. The emotions that used to feel meaningful now appear like weather patterns in an empty sky, real but ultimately meaningless. You sit in meditation hoping to recapture that initial opening, but instead you find yourself wrestling with an increasingly restless mind that won't cooperate. You attend more workshops, read more books, try new techniques, new teachers, new traditions. Nothing works the way it did before. The magic is gone, replaced by a grinding sense of lack that makes your previous dissatisfaction look like contentment. Your identity, that familiar sense of being a consistent someone with a continuous story, starts to feel foreign. You catch yourself in the mirror and don't quite recognize the person looking back. Not in a dissociative way exactly, but in a way that makes you question who you thought you were. The stories you've been telling yourself about your life, why you do, what you want, what matters to you, begin to ring hollow. You're experiencing what the traditions call ego death, but it doesn't feel like death in any clean sense. It feels like slow disintegration, like watching yourself decay while remaining conscious throughout the process. Friends ask you what's wrong, and you can't explain it because you don't understand it yourself. How do you tell someone that you're losing your grip on being a person without sounding insane? This is when most people make one of two choices. They either run back to ordinary life, convincing themselves the whole thing was just a phase, maybe a breakdown, something to be managed and medicated and forgotten. Or they double down on the spiritual path, diving deeper into practices and philosophies, convinced that if they just try hard enough, they can recapture that initial experience and make it permanent. Both choices are understandable. Both are forms of resistance to what's actually happening. Because what's actually happening is that consciousness is beginning the work of dismantling your entire operating system, and there's no pause button, no save point to return to if things get too uncomfortable. The process, once initiated, tends toward completion whether you cooperate or not. Enter the dark night of the soul. This term gets thrown around casually in spiritual circles, usually to describe a bad week or a period of doubt. But the real dark night, the one St. John of the Cross wrote about with such devastating accuracy, is something else entirely. It's not sadness. It's not depression, though it can look like depression to outside observers. It's a specific kind of existential darkness that occurs when consciousness is stripping away all the structures you used to find meaning and connection, but hasn't yet revealed what lies beyond. You pray, if you're the praying type, and the prayers feel like words spoken into a void. You meditate, and meditation becomes a torture session where you're forced to witness your own mental disintegration. Nothing brings relief. Nothing brings comfort. The practices that used to help now feel mechanical and empty. People in the dark night describe it as being abandoned by God, or by whatever divine presence they'd felt during their initial opening. The universe feels not hostile but utterly indifferent. You could live or die, and it wouldn't matter one way or the other. This phase can last months. It can last years, and there's no guarantee it will end, which is perhaps the most terrifying part. You have no map, no timeline, no assurance that this darkness is productive rather than just darkness. The spiritual teachers who write about this stage often do so with the benefit of hindsight, from the other side of the tunnel. But when you're in it, you don't know there is another side. You only know the darkness, and the growing suspicion that you've made a terrible mistake by starting down this path in the first place. Here's where it gets particularly insidious. The ego, that function of consciousness that creates the sense of being a separate self, is extraordinarily clever. It can't stop the awakening process once it's begun, but it can co-opt it. It can appropriate the language and experiences of awakening and use them to create a new, improved version of you, the spiritual you. This is the spiritual ego trap, and it's perhaps the most common place people get stuck. You begin to identify as someone who's more conscious than others, more awake, more evolved. You can see through people's illusions while remaining blind to your own. You develop a subtle, or not so subtle, sense of superiority over those still caught in ordinary consciousness. You use spiritual concepts as weapons to avoid genuine intimacy or to bypass uncomfortable emotions. You become the person at parties who can't resist pointing out how everyone else is asleep, stuck in their egos, trapped in illusion. The particularly cruel irony of the spiritual ego is that it uses the insights and experiences of genuine awakening to reinforce the very structure that awakening is meant to dissolve. You're still operating from separation, still maintaining a self that's special and different, but now that self is dressed in spiritual clothing and wielding awakened language. You might sit in meditation for hours. You might be able to talk fluently about non-duality, emptiness, presence. You might even have genuine experiences of expanded consciousness. But underneath it all, there's still someone there trying to be somebody. The ego hasn't died. It's just gotten more sophisticated in its performance. And the real danger is that this trap is almost invisible from the inside. Everyone else's spiritual ego is obvious to you, but your own remains hidden behind a wall of sincere practice and genuine insight. Meanwhile, the isolation deepens. Your old friends and family look at you like you've joined a cult or lost your mind. You can't relate to their concerns about career advancement or relationship drama or the latest Netflix series everyone's obsessing over. Not because you're better than them, but because those things genuinely don't engage you anymore. The frequency you're operating on has shifted, and it's like trying to have a conversation through a wall. You can hear the sounds, but the meaning doesn't translate. So you drift away from them, or they drift away from you, and you tell yourself it's natural that you've outgrown those relationships, that you need to be around people who understand what you're going through. But finding those people is harder than you expected. The spiritual community you imagined, that sangha of fellow travelers supporting each other on the path, turns out to be full of people carrying their own wounds and projections, playing out their own dramas in spiritual costumes. You're homeless now, not physically, but psychologically and socially. You don't belong in the regular world anymore, but you don't fully belong in the spiritual world either. You're between stories, between identities, between worlds. This liminal space can be incredibly creative, but it's also terrifying. Humans are social creatures who derive much of our sense of self from our relationships and our place in the community. When those anchors dissolve without replacement, the disorientation can be overwhelming. Some people rush to fill this void by attaching themselves to a spiritual teacher or community with an intensity that borders on addiction. They've lost their old identity and need a new one immediately, and a ready-made spiritual identity feels like salvation. This brings us to the guru trap. Now, not all teachers are problematic, and not all student-teacher relationships are unhealthy. But the vulnerability inherent in the awakening process creates perfect conditions for dependency and exploitation. You're disoriented, isolated, stripped of your old certainties, desperate for guidance, and along comes someone who seems to have what you're seeking. They're peaceful, they're clear, they speak with authority about the terrain you're struggling to navigate. It would be so easy to just surrender your authority to them, to let them tell you what to do, how to practice, what to believe. And they might even encourage this surrender, framing it as a spiritual virtue rather than a dangerous abdication of your own discernment. The guru addiction that develops in these situations isn't about sex or money or the obvious abuses that make headlines, though those certainly happen. It's more subtle than that. It's about making your awakening dependent on someone else's validation. It's about outsourcing your spiritual authority to an external figure who becomes the arbiter of your progress. You stop trusting your own experience and instead wait for the teacher to confirm or deny what you're going through. You shape your reports of your practice to match what you think they want to hear. You compete with other students for their attention and approval. The teacher becomes a parent figure, and you regress into childlike dependence, except now it's all justified with spiritual language about surrender and devotion and letting go of ego. Let me pause here and invite you into something, not because I want to interrupt the flow of what we're exploring, but because consciousness is asking for a moment of recognition between us. If this is resonating, if something in these words is meeting you in the middle of your own journey, then consider staying connected to this conversation by subscribing to the channel, not as a casual gesture, but as a conscious choice to keep examining these territories together. And here's what I'm curious about. In the comments, share one assumption about awakening that's been challenged or shattered for you recently. Not a performance of insight, but an honest recognition of something you believed that turned out to be incomplete or wrong. These shared moments of humility create the kind of community that actually supports real transformation, rather than spiritual theater. Now, as we move deeper, we come to something that breaks people more definitively than anything else on this path: the collapse of all meaning. You've survived the dark night. You've recognized the spiritual ego trap and maybe even stepped free of it. You've let go of dependence on teachers and techniques. You've accepted the isolation and the loss of your old life. And then something else happens that nobody prepared you for. All meaning dissolves. Not just the meaning you'd attach to your personal story, but meaning itself as a category. Nothing matters anymore. Not in a depressed way, but in a way that's somehow even more disturbing. A vast, empty neutrality where love and hatred, purpose and purposelessness, suffering and joy all collapse into the same fundamental emptiness. This isn't the peaceful emptiness the books describe. It's not the pregnant void, pregnant with potential. It's a flatness so complete that it makes you question why anyone does anything at all. Why get out of bed? Why eat? Why continue existing when existence itself has been revealed as a cosmic accident with no inherent significance? The universe doesn't care if you're enlightened or ignorant, alive or dead, kind or cruel. It just is, churning away in its mechanical processes, and you're a temporary eddy in that flow with no more meaning than a dust mote or a distant star. This recognition can be absolutely devastating. It removes the last handrail you were holding onto, the last story that gave structure to the chaos. And some people don't survive it, not physically necessarily, though that happens too. But psychologically, they break. They lose the ability to generate sufficient motivation to continue participating in life. The traditions have various names for this stage: the abyss, the void, the crisis of meaning. Modern psychology might call it severe depression or existential crisis, but neither framework fully captures what's happening. It's not that you're depressed because chemical imbalances are making you interpret life negatively. It's that you've seen through the arbitrary nature of all value systems and can't unsee it. The game of life continues around you, people pursuing goals, making plans, caring about outcomes, and it all looks like children playing make-believe, except they don't know it's make-believe, and you can't forget that it is. This is where spiritual emergency can tip into spiritual psychosis. The boundary between profound insight and psychotic break is thinner than anyone wants to admit. Some people experience such complete dissolution of consensus reality that they can't function in the regular world anymore. They might have visions, hear voices, experience reality as far more fluid and malleable than the solid material world others inhabit. Psychiatry would call this psychosis and reach for medication. Spiritual traditions might call it a shamanic crisis or Kundalini emergency. The truth is probably somewhere in between. Consciousness has been pushed so far beyond its normal operating parameters that the structures which create stable perception begin to break down. And without proper support or context, this can lead to genuinely dangerous states where someone loses the ability to navigate basic physical reality. They might stop eating because the distinction between self and other has dissolved so completely that eating feels meaningless. They might put themselves in physical danger because death and life no longer register as meaningfully different. This is not enlightenment. This is emergency. The path through this territory requires something most people don't have: the ability to let everything collapse without trying to reconstitute a self or a meaning structure prematurely. You have to be willing to stay in the groundlessness, in the not knowing, in the absolute meaninglessness long enough for something else to emerge. Not something you create or construct, but something that was always there beneath the layers of seeking and becoming. And here's what almost nobody tells you: you can't make this happen. You can't force your way through by trying harder or practicing more intensely. All trying at this stage is just the ego attempting to survive by appearing to cooperate with its own destruction. The only thing that works is a kind of radical allowing, a complete cessation of the improvement project, a falling backward into an abyss with no guarantee of a bottom. They discover, those who make it through, that awakening was never about reaching some elevated state or becoming an enlightened person. It was about seeing through the mechanism that creates the sense of being a person in the first place. When that mechanism is finally seen clearly enough, it loses its absolute grip. You still function. You still have preferences and make choices. But there's a transparency to it all now. A recognition that consciousness is playing every role in this drama, including yours. The separate self didn't achieve enlightenment. The separate self was revealed to be a convincing fiction all along. A necessary story consciousness tells itself to experience limitation and separation and seeking. This final recognition is usually described as anticlimactic by those who arrive at it. After all that struggle, all that darkness, all that sense of cosmic importance, what's revealed is utterly ordinary. You still take out the garbage. You still feel emotions. You still have a personality and preferences. The difference is subtle but total. There's no one claiming credit for any of it anymore. Life lives itself. Thoughts think themselves. Actions happen without a separate actor pulling the strings. And this seeing doesn't require maintenance or special conditions. It's not a state that comes and goes. It's a recognition of what was always already true, hidden in plain sight by the very seeking that was trying to find it. The spiritual marketplace doesn't want you to know this, because it can't sell you the solution if you realize there's no problem to solve and no you to solve it. The industry built around awakening depends on keeping you in the seeker role, convinced that enlightenment is just one more retreat, one more teacher, one more technique away. But the truth they're not selling is that awakening is the end of that entire game. Not because you've won, but because you've seen through the game itself. You're not improved. You're not transcendent. You're not special. You're just what you always were. Consciousness experiencing itself through this particular form, without needing it to be anything other than exactly what it is. So here's what I want to leave you with. And I want to be completely honest with you because that's what this moment deserves. If you found something of value in this exploration, if these words have met you in a way that matters, then I genuinely invite you to subscribe to this channel. Not because I need your subscription, but because these conversations matter. And having a community of people willing to look at what's real rather than what's comfortable creates something valuable. And I want to hear from you. Really hear from you. What landed? What challenged you? What are you discovering in your own process that we haven't touched on here? Share your experience in the comments, not to perform for others, but to contribute to a space where people can be honest about what this path actually entails. We need fewer spiritual performances and more genuine accounts of what it's like to come apart and discover what remains. Thank you for being here, for listening, for having the courage to look at what most people avoid. That willingness is already the beginning of everything.